Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you all for joining us for our webinar today, Life as a CISO. I'm Anna Soslova. I'm part of the marketing team here at Axonius. Before I introduce and hand it over to our speakers, I wanted to remind all of you that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it shortly after the presentation. I'll also be sending a follow-up email with the link to the recording. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to post them in the questions section on your screens. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A session at the end. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers for today, Lenny Zeltser and Sam Curry. Lenny, who will be our host today, is the CISO of Axonius as well as a senior SANS instructor. Lenny's been active in cybersecurity for over 2 decades, specializing in network defense, security assessment, incident response, and endpoint security. Lenny has also published many articles and other educational content over the years, including his popular security cheat sheets. Our second speaker, Sam Curry, is the CSO of Cybereason. Sam brings over 25 years of experience in security. He was previously the CTO and CISO for Arbor Networks. He also spent 7 years at RSA as CSO, Chief Technologist, and SVP of Product. Sam has 24 patents in security from his time as a security architect and has been a leader in 2 successful startups. With that being said, we're all very excited to have both of you here with us today. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Lenny.
All right, well, hi, Sam. It's so good to be talking with you. You've done a lot of work in the industry. I would love to pick your brain on what's it like to be a chief security officer. I'm relatively new to this role at Axonius, so I got much to learn, and thanks for being open to discussing your experiences with me.
Oh, thank you, Lenny. My absolute pleasure, and hopefully it makes for at least an honest and an entertaining conversation for those who are attending.
Yeah, indeed. You know, what I'm finding is that there's just so much we can all learn from each other. And sometimes we do that just on social networks or when we run into people at events, but there's just never enough time to pick someone's brain, to understand their journey, to see what lessons learned they have arrived at. So let's start with perhaps getting to know a bit your role at Cybereason. You're the Chief Security Officer, and I believe you had and perhaps still have product responsibilities as well. Is that correct?
The first part's correct. The second part is not. So when I first joined Cybereason, the CEO, Lior Div, and we hit it off. But when I went to see him, he had 3 references for me for 3 totally different positions. And he said, so what are you looking to do? And I said, well, look, I'm a cyber executive. I don't mind changing roles or wearing different hats. So I started as the chief product officer with some, call it 80% product and 20% security. But as we grew, the need for, the burden on your time, you can't do everything. I then moved to more 20% product, 80% security. And today I'm an executive at large. I'm the chief security officer. I do a lot of strategy work, and I have some fantastic peers, including a new chief product officer, my colleague Roy Carmel.
I'm fascinated by people who have done product work in security because I used to have those responsibilities until recently myself, and I have been thinking about the extent to which my roles should be all linked to each other directly, or maybe there's some indirect benefits for having worn multiple hats over the years. And it sounds like you see your own career progression as one where you feel okay doing different things as long as they're tied to security. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I actually do a podcast called Security All In, where I talk to people about when they decided they were really a security person, or security said, I'm taking the decision out of your hands. But I used to identify myself as a product guy. I wore many hats, as many of us did in our early careers. I did crypto, I did QA, I did documentation, I did admin functions. And I remember, actually, I was at McAfee. This was the end of the 90s. And we were thinking about, when the .com era was on, we were thinking about what to do with our consumer business. And I was told, okay, Sam's chief security architect for Network Associates. You know, that was the parent company in those days. We're going to do this product division. Sam, you can run product, right? And I thought, I have no idea what that's about. And I went and got training, and I because I knew that I had a deficiency, I said, okay, let's really get to the bottom of this. What does it mean to do product as a separate function from R&D and from marketing and everything else? And I think because I was so concerned of being bad at it and not doing what was needed, I mean, this was a big brand. right? It's the year 2000.
Mm-hmm.
We had
Yeah.
about
a lot of entities.
yeah, so we had a $500,000 online consumer brand. And by the time we were done, nearly 3 years later, it was 330 million a year. I mean, we were the third most successful .com. And I have to tell you, the whole way through, I felt like I was becoming more and more a product guy, but I had this internal concern that I just wasn't good enough for the job. So I kept trying to want to get better at that. And this was in the days when the title CISO was just coming into existence. And I did all these dev and technical functions and product functions for security companies, vendors, and service providers, that I wound up naturally being a security guy at the same time. It wasn't just that I was designing secure products and that I was, I knew network security and I knew crypto and what have you, and identity was a big concern. It was that in the end, I was becoming a pretty good candidate for chief security officer. So I've done that now 4 times in my career, but really those were in the last 6 or 7 years. Until that point, I was either a chief product officer or a CTO once I hit the executive rank.
What in your mind makes someone a good candidate for a chief security officer role?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, most chief security officers come from one of 2 backgrounds. Either they're parachuted in from the rest of the business and they're scared. Who are these people in security that I'm now boss of? And, am I an imposter here? There's a certainty of it, I think, for people that say come from a legal background or a finance or something else. Those are the smaller group. And it's really important to deal with the human trust elements and to overcome that and actually sink your teeth into some security. The other one is we come up through the ranks. And if you come up through the security ranks, as I sort of did, but in various functions, both internal security and selling and building security products, then you wind up with, am I really a C-level executive? You get the opposite problem. And the biggest problem in security, I mean, for all that I work for product companies and service companies over the years, isn't how do we do security? The biggest problem is alignment with the business. And the C-level job is to align to the business. So the roundabout way of answering your question is whether you come from elsewhere into security or you come up through the ranks as a subject matter expert, that what makes you a candidate is that you can live in both camps, that you can both be a security person and be an executive. You can handle the logistics, you can do the lateral relationships. The whole purpose of this call is for us to share and talk with each other and with those who are attending. More lateral dialogues have to happen, and inside security and outside security. So across companies and with the rest of the C-suite, that makes you a good candidate, in my opinion.
And the fact that you can perform that lateral dialogue, I suppose, can come from your experience.
The difficulty is
and formal education. I guess that's what I'm wondering. How should people prepare themselves for that role?
Well, that's a tough one. It's tough because I think it's a different reality now for people that aspire to be CISOs than those that have been here for a few years. Security as a discipline is maturing. And I remember when there were no InfoSec courses, it was an aspect of CS. And I remember then there were a few, and then there were some certificates, and then there were some programs. And now you can go right to a PhD in, quote, security, whatever it's labeled as in an institution. And there's all sorts of certifications. You yourself do SANS and things like that. But I think it was less about formal education. I don't know if that's going to be true in the future. I think cyber touches everything, and we're building a body of knowledge that is hard to absorb. I remember advancing the state of the art and defining it as we went, and it's now become canon to some degree. So apologies that we made some of these decisions and did it that way. But look, I look for attitude first in security people. I look for some soft skills. I look for lack of fear of technology, and that it is all inherently approachable. But here's the problem. We can't have a leaky abstraction. We can't have this veneer that hides the guts of what's going on underneath. I had a conversation just the other day with Anton Chuvakin on exactly this point, which is that we sort of want to know that the people coming up have the same fundamentals as we do in systems internals and in networks and in crypto and in math. I'm very scared that there'll be too much of a veneer, right? The opponents in most of IT is nature. It's first order chaos. It doesn't adapt to you. But in security, it's a human being, which means if you just interact with an abstraction layer, and you don't understand how it works under the hood, you're actually at risk of being exploited by an intelligent attacker, which is our opponent. It's second order chaos. I hope I'm not rambling too much. I want to make sure I stay on point. I do have a deep concern, though, that as we train new people, that there will be large parts of the curriculum that will fade out, and the understanding of what's really happening in the bits and the bytes over time will go away.
Yeah, you know, there used to be a time when I thought that when I was so close to technology myself that I knew how everything worked. I guess the term nowadays is full stack engineer. And while I wasn't an engineer, I was let's call it a full stack technologist, where I could talk about the packets and how they get crafted all the way from the operating system and then application layers. I don't have that knowledge anymore.
Yeah, Tannenbaum's computer networks, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but at some point, the body of knowledge becomes so vast that it's just not practical for everyone to know that many layers intimately. I guess what you're saying, though, is that you can't go to the other extreme and only talk in terms of governance, risk, compliance, and not understand the underlying technology.
Yeah, it's the Dunningkruger effect, right? There's this confidence that comes as you learn a subject and you deal in big animal pictures. And then that confidence is eroded as you realize that there's a whole lot you don't know, right? Not to get too Donald Rumsfeld about it. So the idea is that you build expertise over time, and that confidence in the second wave is more interesting. So I want security to be a place that people can embrace and feel empowered to join it. I want them to be able to learn it at a quick pace. I want us to make it easier for them, but I don't want to make it too easy. I don't want to make it so that it's overly simplified, because that will not serve anybody well if we create a tranche of analysts that are missing even a rudimentary understanding of the packets, of the protocols, of how, you know, asymmetric or symmetric encryption work, for instance, or what's really going on with say Windows internals. Right? I don't want them to. I remember when I did physics, going through Electromag 1 and 2. At the end, finding Maxwell's equations and thinking, wow, these 4 equations describe all my pain for the last two semesters. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? My teacher was a bit of a pin in the, well, anyway, he wound up saying, because it's good for the soul, right? To some degree, I get it, right? That I should go through the same kind of learning because the learning experience was what they were trying to teach, not just the bottom line, especially when the opponent is adaptive and knows where shortcuts have been taken.
I'm worried that, and by the way, I'm in agreement, you know, that hey, the more people know, the better, and you should aspire to know more than you do today, and you should look to see how things work behind the scenes. But I worry that when I say that, I start sounding elitist and as if I'm creating this exclusive club, because I have seen evidence that sometimes just going through the motions, if you don't even understand what you're doing and why, I think can make a difference. Specifically, I'm thinking about PCI DSS compliance. I've worked with a lot of restaurants in my past life, helping them secure their infrastructure. And they were just blindly following PCI DSS. And yes, plenty of breaches, and we all know that compliance does not equate security, but I do believe that if not for that very simple checklist-driven framework, restaurant and I think retail security would be much, much weaker than where it is today.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, let's say, a few dozen or a few hundred person company, where somebody who has no roadmap follows a basic instruction or recipe. That is better than nothing, right?
Yes.
By far, especially because we're talking about the very broad base of the pyramid. But I still think that the bigger targets, that those with more sophisticated shops, need to be very careful that they don't create a ritualized tradition in security. And I think we're far from that, by the way. I don't think we're in imminent danger of having swaths of people that don't understand what's happening under the hood. But I do think we could make it more accessible, and I do think we could make it easier to learn. I think right now we require, we refer to the unicorn, right? The level 3 analyst with all these skill sets. They're a big data person, they're a networking person, a Windows internal person, they're a malware reverse engineer, they're also brilliant socially, and what, of course. probably not the latter, but that's too much. We can make the act of learning security easier and more accessible to more people with dumbing it down only so much. I think that's maybe where academia can help to some degree. I think in the future we're going to have much clearer, roadmaps to learning, and we look at. I want to train people to think and to ask the right questions. When I look at there's this asymmetry in cybersecurity where the attacker enjoys all the advantage, and when you look at so when does the defender win? Take all the products out, take all the services out, take all the hype out. When do they win? It's when somebody somewhere tenaciously says, I'm not going to default to trust, right? I'm not going to just say, it's probably benign and move on. They're like a dog that won't let go of the bone, and they just wrestle with it. And it doesn't matter if they're perfect. It doesn't matter if they have all the knowledge. Those are the instances where people win. Now, we can't all do that all the time. That would be ridiculous because the efficiency would drop. But I want to encourage a little bit more of that. Don't just take it for granted, right? Really shake it a little bit. And it doesn't have to be difficult. There's a difference between, something that is hard to do in a challenge and something that is difficult and onerous. It's a question of involvement. And I certainly think people reach a point where they go, security is for me. And they're going to be curious. It's not just about following a recipe. Your restaurant example is, I need security to be a service that's at least this good. Tell me my part. As opposed to, I'm a security guy. This is what I want to do. That's different. Usually that restaurant example, it's an IT person or a business person who has 20 minutes a day to do something, right?
Yeah. So any specific suggestions for those who are just brand new? They're not going after a CISO job yet. They're way that's maybe ahead of them, or maybe not. By the way, I don't want to make people assume that is the path for anyone who enters the industry as an analyst and eventually they're a CISO. And by the way, what do you do once you become the CISO? Right? That's worth considering as well.
The jumps in the career ladder are huge. I mean, to go from being a security individual contributor to a manager, and from a manager to somebody who worries about the logistics and relations of the department as a whole, massive. But I interrupted you. Your question was about advice for this.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. But I'm thinking is someone's, I don't know, fresh college grad, or sometimes they just have an IT savvy and they didn't even go to college, but they're just smart with IT. They understand what's happening. And they like security, maybe because it appeals to them, because they like defending stuff, or because they like taking things apart. And that's the hacker mentality. How do they get started today versus how people may have gotten started 10 or 20 years ago?
I think there's two sides to this. The first is, what do we say to that person? And then we say, what would you say to the first person they talk to who they're looking to work with or for? So the thing I would say to that person you've regardless of their walk of life, is there's a place in security for you. Certainly at Cybereason, we've hired people to work in the SOC and to go through a level 0 phase as an apprentice or as an intern. We've hired people from mathematics background, history backgrounds. So long as they have the right attitude towards learning and work ethic, and they're not afraid of technology, there's a place that they can start their learning curve. And we desperately need you. There's this huge gap in our industry that we aren't going to fill with just CS grads, right? The second thing is flipping it around to the person who's hiring or is a gateway here. And all of us really, we go to meetups to find security people, but we don't necessarily go to places that aren't already watering grounds for tech people, is consider the person you're not considering. And that's a hard thing to do. I wrote an article on neurodiversity, for instance. I myself have said many times, you need social skills to succeed in security, because you have to have lateral relationships and you have to be able to communicate what's happening in terms that are not arrogant and that people relate to. But I also want the person with autism. I also want the person with Tourette's. I also want the people who think differently. And that's a difficult thing to do. So the onus is on the people who are recruiting and looking and are the gateway to security to say, you know what, I don't know the path for you, but there is one. And that's an article of faith almost, I think. We have to believe that there's a place for everyone in security. And if we don't do that, then we'll continue to have a gap. which would be
Yeah,
unfortunate.
and I think a hiring manager looking to build a diverse team uh, can take the first step and decide that I'm going to go beyond the standard pool of applicants. Perhaps I think that that in itself is not enough. You need to be able to bring a person into a culture and the overall company environment that can accommodate such people. I think that there's a risk of bringing someone in who's fresh, who's got a different perspective, who doesn't quite fit in, and then they will fail
Yeah,
because the
that's a
overall environment in the organization just cannot accommodate them. So I guess the change starts with a hiring manager, but that itself might not
it's
be.
all of us though. It's all of us. And the other thing is, look, diversity is not PC. It is meanly selfish. And I'll be very clear. Our opponents come from all over the globe. They come from America, they come from China, they come from Russia, they come from Africa, they come from Western Europe. How are we going to understand them if we only speak one language or two? Or we don't understand gender, or we don't understand politics. We don't understand the person on the other end of the keyboard is a polymath. If you don't have one because you were looking for just social skills, how are you going to do it? So my boss I mentioned earlier, Lior, he blew me away once. English is a second language for him, and he said, I didn't have a word for diversity, but I knew that to have the best team, I needed all these different perspectives. I needed a soup. And he needed some chaos. I'll give him words he didn't use. So he knew that that was a virtue in a team, and that diversity helped him get a competitive advantage. It wasn't yes, it's a good thing to do socially. Yes, we can feel good about that, but that's not the reason for doing it. That's a benefit of doing it. The reason that it becomes compelling is you'll simply get crushed if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and then one of the things you touched upon is the gap between how you start out. You're a new person in the industry. You got hired, great. Hopefully, you're in an environment that allows you to succeed. And then, as you progress forward, one of the mistakes that I've seen people make is to assume that the way as a technologist to grow in your career is to eventually become a manager of a small team and then a manager of a bigger team. And that's certainly a way. And unfortunately, in many companies, that's the only way to move up. But that is a big problem, I think. Right? Have you seen that happen in your experience?
Many times. But I have a wonderful role model. The greatest rebel I know, I hope he's not listening, is my dad. My father, he calls that the greasy pole. He says that you feel dirty doing it. You don't really have another path that you can see, and so you think that this is the natural progression. To put things in context, he was the director of the Royal Society of Canada. He was the head of computer science, University of Quebec, many years ago. He's a developer, and he became a manager, and he became a VP, and he had a startup. And today he's retired, and he's still a developer. He's still a security developer, and he's never been happier, right? So I remember when I was at EMC and at CA, we emphasized individual contributor tracks having actual authority on a par with the management track. And it was okay we had banding at CA. We had like, if you were a 2 or a 3, a 2 was an SVP, a 3 was a VP, and so on. You could have somebody of a higher band reporting to you who's an individual contributor. And so we talked about how do you reach the VP rank? How do you reach the SVP rank as an architect, as a developer, and at EMC we had distinguished engineers, of which I was one, and even fellows, right? So like, how do you get to that? But those aren't the only ones even then, right? Harvard Business Review, I found this article years ago. It said the best way to get ahead and to stay ahead, put that to the side for a minute, is to move laterally. And I would say, in fact, that none of us were like Babe Ruth, who pointed at the stands and hit the ball there. If you ask someone, how did you get here? Everyone's got a rational story, because if you didn't, you'd sound like you were irrational, and who wants that? But most of our careers are Brownian, right? It's sort of like generally chaotic motion that's moving in a direction, because it wasn't planned. It's not like there was and I think this is maybe, as a Gen Xer looking at the younger generation, and with all respect for them, I think we may have done them a disservice by making it seem like there are channels, go find your channel, as opposed to go be the best you, and the channel, when you look back, you'll be able to tell the right narrative, right?
Yes.
So I hope that helps people thinking like, so what is the path? And the answer is just do the things you love laterally and move to the things you want. and maybe there's too much faith, maybe there's some bias in how I got here and what time we were economically and what countries I was in, but I genuinely believe that if you really stick to what you love to do and move among them, you'll make some choices for value, you'll make some choices for career, you'll make some choices for self-improvement. I believe that's the best career, rather than just straight to the top. And the Harvard Business Review said, if you go straight to the top, you don't tend to stay there very long.
I think the important thing that you said, at least what I heard there, one of the things was that you said, first of all, you got to do what you love, right? And what you're good at. Sometimes the two are connected. Hopefully you both love what you're good at and you're good at what you love. But that in itself is not enough. I think that's an overly
simplistic. It doesn't
just do what you love. You'll do well. I'm not sure that's enough. I think what you also said is that you got to, which words you use, move laterally. You got to have situational awareness. You got to have savvy. You got to know how to get ahead, right? And how to see opportunities that others might not see. I think that's important as well. Do what you love. Do what you do well. Otherwise, you might not get very far, I suppose. But also see where the opportunities are beyond what many would call a traditional path that I've outlined earlier. Be the manager of managers.
Yeah, when I was at RSA, people look at my resume and they go, wow, okay, you were a big chunk of time, 5 years at CA, 7 years at RSA, 5 years at McAfee. Cool, but if you unpack it, I actually had 13 bosses at RSA and 7 different job titles, right? And I think what's that?
Is it because all big organizations reorganize themselves every 3 months?
Partly. We're multiple BUs, we're one company, we're multiple BUs. It doesn't really matter. But honestly, I self-identified as a product manager because that was what was available then. And I then learned how to be an executive, and it kind of didn't matter what the job title was. And that's still my attitude today. It didn't matter if I was called CTO one day or CSO or Chief Product Officer another day. There was the organization always knew I was leader, right? I lived that. I was a security guy. The customers trusted me. And every day I woke up and tried to do the most effective thing I could. At CA, it was a little different, but I did get to try different jobs along that path within the same company, which was fascinating. And really good teams adapt, right? Pretty much as soon as a reorg happens, it's hard at scale, but pretty much as soon as changes happen in an organization, more changes are required.
Yes.
It's kind of an artificial constraint to say, hey, I was in a security career. I went up step by step every 3 years, and I expect to be sitting at the top of my job for 10 or 15 years and then retire. That's kind of not how it works these days, right? I think it's more about, I think the most important thing is if you figure out your mission and you figure out your role with respect to your organization, don't make dumb moves. Obviously make some moves for the job, make some moves for the experience. I think you'll be far better off than having an expectation of this notion of career lifing somewhere.
Yeah, and I think now that I understand what you mean by moving laterally. I wanted to point out that I believe that kind of lateral movement that you're describing can exist sometimes within the same organization, especially if you're working for a large company like, let's say, IBM or CA. But sometimes that lateral move might only be available to you if you go to another organization, if you're working for a small company.
That's true. It's and sometimes you stick it out. My advice there is it's going to be a gut thing. People rarely do anything for one reason. Usually you'll have 2 or 3 reasons that compel you to finally make a change. But it's a tough thing. You have social rewards, you have moral rewards, you have financial rewards. You have to think about your family, you have to think about where you are in life, and what you want to get out. Do you have a mission, for instance? These are tough trade-offs, and to say, oh, just do this would be naive. And this is where I'm very respectful of the journey that immigrants face, or women, or the younger generations in the workforce, because it's not going to be the same as mine. And we put this podcast together, Life as a CISO. I can tell a CISO's journey. I don't know how much of it is directly portable, so I'm going to err on the side of overshare. For anybody who's listening, because they have to go, not relevant to me, or hey, that is, and you probably are thinking similarly there. It's not a just follow this recipe. Here's the trick I used. I didn't even know I was headed to be a CISO really until very late.
Yeah, yeah. And so now that you are a CISO, let's talk a bit about your life as a CISO today. For example, with whom do you interact on a regular basis within Cybereason?
Well, the product organization to some degree. The product organization is one. I often do a lot of content validation for our marketing organization or even generation. I say, oh, this is about ABC, and then they go write something. R&D, IT. IT is probably one of the most important organizations to interact with. But R&D is another one because I work for a company that makes a security product. I want it to be secure, and I want it to have. I want to be, I am patient zero, meaning, if it's going to break, it's going to break on me before anybody else. So I also cultivate a lot of relationships with other CISOs through our advisory board, and I pick a few companies for whom I'm going to be an executive sponsor. Because look, at the end of the day, my company's got 500 employees. Yes, we're part of a large set of companies that SoftBank's invested in, for instance. And so I talk to those CISOs, but my customers are tens and hundreds of thousands of systems. I need to know their pains, and I have a unique ability to get the attention of R&D. So I also do some of that executive sponsorship and bridging as well.
How much time do you spend meeting with or talking with customers of Cybereason's product?
Probably about direct face-to-face meetings, about 4 or 5 days a month max. There'll of course be a period where we do like an advisory board meeting face-to-face once a year, that type of thing. Indirectly, I'm also interacting, by the way, with CISOs who aren't my customers. I live in Boston, so I'm a CISO in the Boston region with 20 or 30 other CISOs I talk to regularly. Also in the US, and we have different channels. One we use a Signal group, another one we use WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp group, and then the final one we have a Slack channel at the US level. And I think you're involved in one of them. But the fact is that I spend quite a bit of informal time talking with my peers in the industry in a way that I didn't do until about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. It's like we suddenly woke up and said, hey, these tools we're using in social media and within companies I can use to create a network of security people who are experiencing the same thing I am, and even my competitors. So I know the CISOs and CTOs for the companies that I go head to head with in the market, and I think that's a healthy thing too.
Yeah. I'm also finding myself entering these networks again. I'm relatively new to the CISO role, so I'm just getting started. But for me, it's been incredibly helpful talking to people who have similar responsibilities in other tech companies, especially because we are all dealing with similar problems. And the solutions might be similar too of companies in a given industry or in given sizes. Specifically, I found it especially useful talking to companies that are relatively young, let's say 5 years or so, because their IT and security and product architecture, it's very different from those that were built, let's say 10 to 15 years ago.
Totally true. Look, but I think you also have a product background, right? The thing about being on the product side is we're supposed to be the owners of the pain, right? We're supposed to do that. And so it's natural we get a Stockholm syndrome and we become the people experiencing the pain, right? So my people are the security tribe first and foremost, and that's hard to shake.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I wonder, how do you think being a chief security officer of a security company is different from being a CISO, a CSO of another kind of company?
Well, every time I've wound up in that situation, and it's really been 3 or 4 times that I've been a CISO, although the 4th time we were trying to become a security company, from a BI company to a security company. It always felt like the cobbler's children to some degree, right? Do they have shoes?
Yeah.
Because it's not just that, obviously we always had security, but in one case it was a startup, in another case a company that had been around for 15 years, but it was a mid-sized company. In the other, it was one of the oldest brands in security ever. So there was a mature security program, but it was never perfect enough for me. I'm like, how could we not do this? Some of the mistakes that I made, though, was the CISO is not the voice of security. This was tough for me because I noticed, especially when I was a transplant CISO, I went from one company to another. I wanted at every C-level and board meeting to leap on everything security, like that's mine. Like I'm all over it. And that was a mistake because it meant others didn't feel, well, the other C-level were like, oh, Sam's got it. Not my thing, right? I was hurting myself really badly. Instead, what I needed to do was the opposite. People in the crunch needed to hear me talk about security and risk. But outside of that, they needed to see that I cared about everything else about the business. That made me a business stakeholder first. And I needed them to think security isn't in the box that Sam manages, like finance is in the CFO's box, or manufacturing is in the R&D box. I needed them to be like, all of us at the C-level care about all of us at the C-level. And so when security topics come up, I should have only opened my mouth if it was high urgency, or I was being asked a question. Aside from that, I should have let people have a discussion and feel a piece of ownership. Big lesson. And as a result, if you look at my resume, you'll see there's a stint I had that was only 8 months as a CISO. That was the one, because it was suddenly I was becoming more and more isolated instead of more and more integrated.
So how do you get to that point? Is it just a matter of keeping your mouth shut and just letting the silence fill the room until one of the other executives owns it?
Sort of. No, not owns it. They all have to feel some ownership of it, right? So rather than see yourself in security starts with me and everything's going to talk to me about it, instead it's like, relax. Look, in security, if you come up the ranks, we've done so by being the smartest person in the room. We had the answer. What's going on? It's this piece of malware. How's it operating? Like this. What's the domain? It's that. Hey, I remember that IP address from last year. It was this actor. Like, you're trying to dazzle people and prove that you are hyper competent. By the time you reach the C-level, you don't need to do that. Everybody in the room knows you're the security guy. Relax, breathe. Let them feel like they're in the conversation, because if you just jump in with the answer, you're that kid in class who's got his hand up the whole time. Everyone else is like, all right, don't worry, he's got it. You need to just say, hey, how do you all feel about this? Where do you come from? What are you worried about? Don't jump in with the answer. I advised the CISO, I hope, I'm not going to mention who it is, but I hope he doesn't recognize himself in this story, whose boss had left and he was the interim CISO. And he said, I've got a great plan. I need you to look at it. And he showed it to me and he said, isn't that a great plan? I said, that's a fantastic plan. And I had spoken to his boss. This was a bank. I knew the senior exec, and this person had said, I'm concerned the interim CISO isn't really a business guy. I'm concerned he's too in the weeds. I thought, And as he presented this plan to me, I got it. He said, do you have any advice for me? I said, yeah, don't give your plan. What? I said, yeah, don't give your plan. Here's what I want you to do in your first meeting. I want you to turn up and I want you to say, hey, I have some ideas. I have a plan that I was working on under the former CISO, but I'm leaving it outside the room. I'd like to talk to you about what matters at a business level. What is the C-level talking about? What are the objectives for the year? And then leave the room when you have the answers. Ask some questions, talk a bit, but get out. And wait a week. This may feel contrived. Then open up your deck, see if it applies, and then ask for a meeting to present it. Do that. Don't jump in on the first meeting. He said, okay, that's great advice. So 2 weeks later, I had a meeting with him because I was asked to mentor him. I said, how did it go? He goes, well, I took your advice, but I couldn't help it. I showed my presentation. And I said, how did that go? He goes, well, he listened and he nodded and he asked me some questions, but I have a bad feeling. I said, what? He goes, I've asked for a second meeting and he's been pushing it off. And so I'm like, okay. And wouldn't you know it, a month later, they were hiring for the new CISO. This was, he had to show up with the answer. He had to prove he knew. He knew. Instead, he should have had it as a chance for dialogue. It shows you listen. It shows you're a leader. It shows you care about the business needs. You didn't just turn up to show how smart you were and present. You made it look like you went away and you could have come back and said, based on what we talked about, here's what I'm thinking. It wasn't about the PowerPoint deck you got perfect. It was about your interaction at the C-level. That's what I'm talking about.
And Sam, to have that meaningful discussion, to ask the right questions, to understand the answers. How does one get that knowledge? Because what you're describing, it's not security, it's not even IT, it's understanding how marketing works, how finance works. Are we talking about
Well, that's the
pursuing
tough
an
thing,
MBA program or reading up some business books?
that's the tough thing. Look, we all learn differently, so I won't pretend that there's like a secret to this, but I'm willing to bet that if you asked a CFO or a chief legal counsel, and by the way, with chief legal counsel, avoid ever saying, you know, my legal opinion is. Never do that, right? Just FYI. Always say, I'm not a lawyer. It looks like this. In your professional opinion, am I right? But if you asked a CFO or chief legal counsel or chief marketing officer or anyone, hey, I've got a great security person here, great listener, not an expert in your thing. Do you mind spending a little time explaining your thing to them? They will. They would love that. What they want is somebody to sit at the table who is a master of their domain, and they will grant you the trust that you are a master of your domain because you're there. And they will expect you not to be a master of their domain. It's weird. You don't have to take an MBA to sit with the CFO. You do need some basics. You can even ask them sometimes, find a friend who's a CFO in your network outside your company and say, could you just walk me through the basics? How do I read a P&L? How do I read a P&L? You don't need an MBA.
And can you recommend a book or an article, right?
Yeah, I recommend a book or ask another CISO, right? I mean, yes, I've been a general manager and I've managed some pretty big businesses. I had that luck because I came up the product side, but a lot of most CISOs didn't. So, you know, certainly anybody who knows me, you can always say, hey, Sam, as a general manager, what would you be looking for to P&L and how do you think of risk? Take off your cyber hat. Because I have friends that I ask, I have a friend in the healthcare industry. I ask him all the time, how do you deal with risk in healthcare? And he'll tell me, right? So the network of fellow security people in our tribe has a lot of experience that can fill the gap, and they can help you if you're too embarrassed to do it with your peers, especially if you're new at a company. No one wants to be like, hey, I'm an idiot, I don't know all this stuff. But it's particularly hard, I think, for people who grew up in security by being subject matter experts. We had to know, or it was the end of the world. The bad thing would happen, and suddenly we're put somewhere where we don't know, and that's scary.
It's very interesting. Some of the things that you had mentioned are helping me better understand how to deal with the imposter syndrome, which I think a lot of people, if not everyone in the industry experiences. I certainly do.
Me included, everyone.
Yeah. And one way, I guess, to do that is to remind ourselves what you said a couple of times in this conversation, and that is, if you got here, if you got to this role, then clearly you know what you're talking about. Assume that people will give you the benefit of the doubt if you take the time to listen to them and to understand their challenge.
And by the way, selfishly, a great thing to do is go teach. Go back and talk to some students. The mental exercise of trying to explain what you know to someone and putting yourself in a position where you don't know what you don't know again will remind you that you aren't an imposter.
Yes. Yeah.
It's also, if you're one of those people who's like, well, what's the benefit of that? And what's the direct gain? You will feel uncomfortable doing this. If you don't like public speaking, you will feel uncomfortable doing this. Both are good feelings. Do it. But I get involved with local community colleges. I work with academia sometimes. I've done so with Purdue, with MIT, and schools like, I'm trying to get more involved with like Wentworth and Nichols College in Massachusetts, because I get a lot out of it, and Brandeis as well. I try to go and talk to the students, and the act of saying, how do I explain to somebody who's not anywhere on this path some benefit of what I know and that they want to receive, you suddenly go, oh, my imposter syndrome is vanishing.
Yeah, I'm certainly, I feel that as well, because I teach security courses at SANS Institute, and I found that on the one hand, when I teach, I remind myself that I do know certain things, otherwise I would be standing there silent, and if I'm talking, I guess I have something to say. On the other hand, it reminds me that there's still plenty for me to learn, because inevitably somebody in the room asks a question and makes a comment that shows you that there's still much more for you to learn. And that has worked well for me as well.
I blog for the same reason. I write on Forbes. Sometimes I'm thinking, oh, it's because blank, blank, blank. And I go, wait, is that interesting to people to read? Is that interesting for another security person to read? And the purpose of writing isn't to be right. The purpose of writing is to have a discussion that makes the whole better. So sometimes we forget that we're part of a community. Humans aren't brilliant in isolation, right? We're brilliant in collaboration. Yeah, and in discussion. And the security story advances whenever two of us talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I have to remind myself that as well, because I write and blog, and on the one hand, sometimes it's hard to come up with a topic because you think, well, it's obvious. Surely everybody already knows this, and I have to remind myself that maybe, by the way, and if that's the case, then okay, you wrote something that everybody knows, but chances are plenty of people don't know that. And also similarly, I worry that I have to have a very well articulated, defensible statement that's foolproof and bulletproof. And then I think, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's okay. All right. We were talking earlier when we were getting started for the webinar, the joys of working from home and the fact
that was my wife who just walked in. So yeah.
Yeah, we get to interact with people around us. We don't live in isolation. So yeah, I guess to build upon the point that you just made for both writing and speaking, sounds like it's a good thing. You're encouraging people to go and speak at a local college, find an event like B-Sides. You got a thing to say, say it, you get feedback. Similarly, if you're writing articles or blogs, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is I have a circle of people that I seek feedback on my blogs for, or you know, on my presentations before I give them. I do a dry run, and I listen to them as well, because you'll see that it's actually better than you think. The weak spots will become obvious that maybe you're in every iteration you're missing the fact that you have a typo or you're not phrasing it right. It just is much easier if you do the creative process, go through, and then have somebody do the first edit, and you do it for them as well. Right?
Yeah. You got to find,
and it becomes a machine.
You got to find the people whom you trust, who you're comfortable with, and they can give you very, very valuable feedback. Yeah. On the other hand, that can backfire. I remember the first time I ever gave a security presentation at a large conference, I did a dry run with my wife, who is not at all related to security. She is a very visual graphic design person. And so I explained to her something about network security. I was talking at the time, and she listened to everything. And then she said, all right, never ever do this to me again. She was just not interested at all. And I realized, okay,
I have to tell you a funny story about my wife.
Not the right audience. Maybe I should have picked my focus group a little bit better.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Look, my wife, I came home the other day. I have two funny stories to tell you. And I said, there's been a horrible breach at brand, and that caused this and this and this. And she goes, so what? I said, what? She goes, yeah, you come home every day and say there's been a horrible breach somewhere. And I was like, wow. And that was a lesson, right? But my favorite one is,
yeah.
And it was like, wow, okay. I'm like, and then I went to the mailbox and I had yet another note that somewhere an account with our data has been compromised. We all suffer it. But my favorite story about my wife is we went to RSA conference, and I don't have time to walk the floor anymore because it's like not only is it a security reunion, it's meeting, and presentations. And so I said, honey, can you go on the show floor? Like, here's your badge. Can you go on the show floor? This is before we had children. I said, can you go around and find the most interesting booth to you? And she's not a security person. And she did that for 2 days, and then she came back and said, I found it. This is the company name. I won't say it was. And I said, what did you like about them? First of all, what do they do? And she said, they do this thing called PKI. And I thought, what? And then she started to explain it to me. She wasn't doing a bad job. And I said, oh yeah, well, I got to go see how they managed to convince my wife, who's never done security, about this. And so I went to the booth, and the reason that she had figured it out was because they were giving away free martinis. And so she had hung out there to get free martinis. Somebody had figured out, how do I get somebody to listen to something so complex? And they had lured her in. Typical show floor type trap, but she had learned PKI with a martini in her hand.
Well, I have perhaps matured over the years, and now actually, despite the first difficult presentation to my wife that I did when I was starting out, I now find myself going to her much more often, and to my kids as well, because sometimes they ask me, what are you working on? What are you preparing on? And I find, and what product is this? And I find that if I can explain what I'm doing in plain terms
Yeah.
and can have a meaningful conversation with someone who's not in my industry all the time, that means that I understand it quite well myself. I think it goes back to
And your family won't tolerate condescension.
no,
That's
of course.
which is important, right? They'll be like, don't talk down to me. And here's the thing: if we explain to our peers like they're a 5-year-old, they know we think they're a 5-year-old, right? So a good thing is simplifying without making it dumb, which brings us back to what we started with.
Yes, and perhaps now that we're in the very beginning of where we began, we should start wrapping up. So thank you, Sam, for the discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm not sure if we have any questions that derived from the audience or if we have time to tackle those questions, but let's see.
Yeah, thanks, Lenny and Sam. We did get a handful of questions, but we only have time for a few of them. So the first question came in related to something you mentioned briefly. How does a CSO engage other C-level executives in terms of communicating risks?
Well, I don't think it starts with a risk conversation. Look, if you're in an emergency and you have to communicate something, you can get their time. You ring the emergency bell. But I think what's important is that in peacetime, you spend time with them. Trust is built based on being credible, being reliable. But here come the doozies: aligning with each other in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and spending time and breaking bread with each other. We mentioned that we're social creatures, and spending time at the watering hole together that isn't structured time is the way that you have access to them when you need them and it's not a crisis. And Lenny, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think it's important to get to know each other so that you, when it's time to work in a business context, you treat each other as colleagues, but also as humans, and sometimes maybe as friends, but certainly as people who just know each other and trust each other. And I think I'll refer to the earlier part of our conversation where you mentioned the importance of understanding what's on their mind and framing your concerns, your risks, perhaps when the time is right to discuss them, in terms that are important to them. Yeah, in terms of business, I don't know, marketing, product objectives, finance-related metrics, for example.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. To what extent do CISOs need to sell security internally to the directors and officers, or should the CISO follow orders and do the security they ask for? Sam, do you want to start us off?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of those as opposites. To what degree should they be saying, "Hey, I need to be on your radar," versus take? I don't think people in most walks of life go, "Hey, I really need security to do this thing." I've seen it when it's, for instance, we need strong authentication, or we need perhaps we need to use FIPS 140-2 modules in our product. Go get the CISO to dedicate some resources, or make sure. But most of that is business driven, and I don't think there's a problem with doing it. In fact, I welcome it when someone says, "How does common criteria work? I've never done it." And I'm like, "Well, I've done it almost every year since 1998. Yeah, let me help you, and I can make your life a lot easier." I'm fine with doing that. The more difficult thing is when you go, that way that you operate, I'd like you to do it differently. I think in that world, you can't just turn up with a list of requests. You've got to embed security in what they do. I believe in agile approaches to security policies and keeping them fresh and current. Yes, you can explain, here's the risk, and if you do this, life gets better. But I'm reminded of when we tried to get developers in one of my previous companies to use VDI and virtual desktops. And they didn't, because we were asking them to program differently. We were asking them to change their workflows. And it was only after we had a horrendous breach that went quite public, and you can probably figure out where it was, that the developers turned, okay, how can we make our everyday life better? And we had a window of forgiveness to introduce ways of doing things. But I remember 6 months after that, a director in the R&D side said, "Why am I doing this? And don't tell me it's because of security again. I understand that better now." So you don't take advantage of it. It is a dialogue. And if you need to change behaviors, also be willing to contemplate how to make policies more effective and human ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Lenny, what do you think?
If I were to add to that, I think there are several sources of power in a business environment, and that relates to not just security, but anything. Sometimes you can convince others to do what you think they should do through a formal reporting relationship. You must do this because I outrank you. Perhaps it works better in the military than in the business setting, but sometimes that is the source of power that you might have, especially if you control a person's bonus, whether or not they stay at the company. Okay, maybe you can do that, but that's uncommon for CISOs, especially if you want your other colleagues, your peers, to do what you think is right for the organization from security perspective. Other sources of power involve collaborative incentives that are aligned, so talking in terms that are relevant to that person, to that department. How is it that your initiative helps them? I think that's important as well. And then something that might be embedded in the culture of an organization, where sometimes people will follow security requirements just because it's in the DNA of the organization. Perhaps a given environment might have in its culture the fact that we all report every strange email that we see, because our security awareness training removed the stigma of doing that, for instance, or the thing that we all do is we are careful to, I don't know, pick strong passwords, for example. So yeah, looking at culture, looking at collaborative initiatives, and sometimes formal reporting relationships.
Hey, I have one thing to add. You made me think of, Lenny. For those who are attending, there's a book called The Re-Engineering Alternative. You can probably find it on Amazon. It's a short book, but there's really great blogging on what it says. It talks about culture, and culture is defined as where authority comes from. And they talked about what you were talking about, Lenny. Is it come from a military-like hierarchy? Does it come from community consensus? Does it come from a family-like collaboration environment, and so on? So there's several models. Highly recommend, go check it out, and try to identify what kind of culture you have and where authority comes from, because that will be the secret to your organization. And if you come from one type, like a military style hierarchy, and you go to a subject matter expertise, competence culture, you will fail if you try to go to the same sources of authority. So it's called the re-engineering alternative.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Lenny. And thanks everyone again for joining today. Like I mentioned, we recorded the webinar, so you'll get a copy in the next few hours. In the meantime, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at anna@axonius.com, and I'll get it to the right person. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Are we off?